I would like to start with a pretty simple thought experiment. Imagine you're in an airplane crash. Sorry, it sounds with bad news. Imagine you're in an airplane crash and somehow you've survived. And quite a few of the other passengers have survived as well. I want you to try and think of what would happen in such a situation. There are two options, basically. On planet A, people behave, well, not in a really wonderful way, actually in a quite selfish way. So there's a lot of pushing and shoving. People try to get out as quickly as possible. And they even trample over the elderly and maybe even over the kids. They just want to save their own lives. That's what happens on planet A. Now, on planet B, pretty much the opposite happens. People actually work together. They are much more cooperative, and they help the elderly get out of the plane. There's an orderly evacuation. And sometimes it even happens that people say, while there's smoke and fire going on, and people really realize they got to get out as quickly as possible, sometimes they even say, no, you go first. No, you go first. So my question to you is, and you can answer the question in your app on the phone, on which planet do we actually live? What is reality like? Do we live on planet A, where people, are mostly selfish, especially in the times of crisis? Or do we live on planet B, the more utopian planet, right, where people are much more cooperative? I'm very curious what you think, because basically my whole speech depends on your answers, right? So I can sort of, know what the intellectual levels should be, et cetera, et cetera. So if we can, if we can show the results, that'd be really great. Okay, this is really interesting. It's almost split. 58% thinks planet A, the selfish planet. Quite a few people think planet B, the more cooperative planet. But still, the vast majority of people think that most of us would behave in a pretty selfish and depressing way. Now, what's interesting is that this theory that most of you buy into is actually a pretty old idea. So scientists call it Veneer Theory. Veneer theory is the notion that our civilization is just a thin veneer, just a thin layer, and that below that lies raw human nature. That now we're all, nicely dressed, etc. You've got all your suits. But in times of crisis, we show who we really are, right? Animals, beasts. It's basically a dog-eat-dog world out there. This theory, Veneer theory, comes back again and again and again in our culture. So you can already find it among the ancient Greeks. You can find it among the Orthodox Christians. The church father, St. Augustine, for example, who coined the notion of original sin, right? The idea that we're all sinners deep down. But you can also find it among the Enlightenment philosophers of the 17th and the 18th century. So one example here is this guy, Thomas Hobbes. Are there any fans of Thomas Hobbes in the audience today? Yes? One? He's a pretty great philosopher, one of the great thinkers of the past few centuries. So Thomas Hobbes was a British philosopher who argued that in the state of nature, back in the old days when we were still nomadic hunter-gatherers, we lived lives that, in his famous words, were nasty, brutish, and short. And supposedly back then, he argued, we were engaging in a war of all against all. And that was basically what life was like for most of human history, up until the moment when we invented civilization. And we started building that layer of, that veneer of civilization, right? We signed a social contract, we gave up our liberty, and we got security in return, right? We appointed what Hobbes called a leviathan, a powerful ruler, a manager, people like you, right? To be in charge at the top so that basically people are protected from themselves. That was his view, Thomas Hobbes' view. And it's been enormously influential in our culture. If you look at so many organizations still today, if you look at the way we do democracy, if you look at how we design schools, prisons, you name it, you still see the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes everywhere. It's still so very often grounded in this view that people deep down are fundamentally selfish, and therefore we need hierarchy, we need bureaucracy, we need control, we need all those kind of things, because let's face it, in reality we live on planet A. Now, I have only one problem with Veneer theory. Just one small problem, and that's the fact that it is completely, totally, and utterly wrong. So what I want to tell you about today is about a new view of human nature that has emerged in the past couple of decades. I want to tell you the story of how scientist after scientist has moved on to a much more hopeful view of who we are as a species. This has happened in anthropology, it has happened in archaeology, in psychology, in sociology, you name it. Experts from many, many different disciplines have moved on to a much more hopeful view of who we are and what we can achieve together. Now, I also want to emphasize in advance, this is not just armchair philosophy. This is philosophy with radical implications for how we live our own lives, as leaders, as colleagues, also our private lives, because once you update your view of human nature, basically everything changes. So I also want you to encourage to think about for yourself, what actually is my view of human nature? Because our view of human nature tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. What we assume in other people is what we get out of them. This is the thing about stories, right? We humans, we become the stories that we tell ourselves. And the risk sometimes is, when we assume that most people are selfish, is that we create exactly the kind of people that our theory presupposes. But I want to convince you first of some of the things that have been going on in science. So let's take a look at what's been going on in the field of sociology. Sociologists have for a very long time asked this simple question: what do people do in times of crisis, right? What do they do when there's an airplane crash, when there's a tsunami, when there's an earthquake or something terrible going on? How do people behave? And well, we all watch the news, and then we usually hear about the looting and the plundering in situations like that. Maybe you remember this terrible disaster, 2005. Katrina hit New Orleans. You might also remember the news coverage back then. It was full of terrible stories about people looting and plundering and basically being horrific beasts and acting very violently. That was the story that was told at the time. There were a lot of op-ed columnists back then who were saying, see, the veneer of civilization is really very thin. And this is still what happens very often. You just watch for it in the news, there's a hurricane, there's a tsunami or something like that, and then people start talking about the thin layer of civilization. I always get really frustrated when I read that, because there's a huge amount of evidence from sociology. Actually, we have more than 500 case studies that were done since the end of the Second World War, done by the Disaster Research Center, mainly in the US. And anthropologists and sociologists, etc., have again and again tried to study the behavior of most people after disasters. And what they've discovered is that actually, time and time again, crises tend to bring out the best in people. That's really what you get. So that also happened after Katrina. Later, when they fact-checked all those stories, it turned out that most of them didn't really happen the way that was first described. It was mostly rumors going around. And actually, the vast majority of people behaved really altruistically. And even if there was looting, then it was looting basically to spread food and supplies among those who really need it. And I think that's very important, because in this case, actually, the false belief that people are fundamentally selfish had really pernicious consequences. It took weeks before emergency services went in, because they were afraid, that a lot of terrible people were going to do terrible things to them. That wasn't the case at all. So you see the bad consequences of having this wrong view of human nature. Now, the thought experiment that I started with was given to me by Tom Postmas. He's a professor of sociology, and he always asks this question to students. And actually, you're a relatively smart audience that, only 60% of people said we live on planet A, because the vast majority of students, professionals, and even emergency responders often believe that we live on the selfish planet, with all the terrible consequences. This is what he experiences in his daily work. Now, that's just what sociology has been telling us. Let's move on to a different field of some new findings that we have from psychology. Does anyone know who this is? Anyone has any idea? This is Kitty Genovese. She was a woman who lived in New York, in a pretty posh neighborhood, Kew Gardens, in the 60s, and she was killed in 1964. The New York Times at the time reported that she was stalked by a man for an hour. The man had a knife who tried to stab her again and again and again. And when the attack happened, for more than an hour, 37 people have been witnessing what was happening, but no one did anything. No one even called the police. So that was the headline on the front page of the New York Times. 37 people watched this happen and did nothing. A really depressing story about how people can apparently sometimes behave in a big anonymous city. Now, at the time, this was the inspiration for psychologists to look into what they call the bystander effect. You may have heard about this. So the bystander effect is this phenomenon where something happens, someone's drowning or someone's being attacked in the street, but people don't really do anything to help because they're like, oh, you know, it's not my responsibility. I can get coffee or something like that. They just don't do anything. And the tricky thing about the bystander effect is that the more people witness something, the less likely is that the person in need will actually be helped. At least that was what the result was of the research that happened in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, a lot of the experiments that happened in the laboratory where they set some kind of, set something in stage. Someone would come into the lab, there was some fake emergency, and they tried to basically study how people would behave. And the message was, there is something called the bystander effect, and people don't really help each other. This has been the subject of countless documentaries, nonfiction books, pop psychology classes, you name it, etc., etc. I must be honest here, I used to believe in it as well. It was only fairly recently that I looked at this particular video. So this is something that happened in Amsterdam. Let's take a look. There's a woman who parked her car near the canal, but left her baby inside and forgot to put on the brakes. So the car has fallen into the canal, and very quickly, 4 guys jump into the water. They don't even communicate with one another. And most importantly, at the last moment, one of the guys has received a brick, a stone, from one of the other bystanders, who was a woman. And then at the very last minute, this shouldn't have taken 10 seconds longer, but at the very last minute, they managed to break open the back window and get out the women and the baby. This all happens in just 2 minutes, the whole thing. And as I said, it shouldn't have taken much longer because otherwise they would have passed away. This is 6 meters deep, so if they would have been gone. And then you see an army of bystanders, and there's the cop, actually. The cops are a little bit too late. But you see an army of bystanders actually helping the woman and her child get out of the water. And I was looking at this at the time, and I remember thinking, what's going on here? Is this superior Dutch culture or something like that we still help each other? Does it say something about these 4 guys? Is this the exception to the rule, or is there something else going on, right? Because according to the bystander effect, this shouldn't happen. This was a very crowded, busy street, right? A lot of people saw it happening, and 4 people intervened. So what's happening here? Then I spoke to this woman. She's Marie Lindegaard. She's a social psychologist from Denmark. And she's done some extraordinary new research into the bystander effect. Remember that most of the original research was all, lab experiments, sort of fake situations where they tried to make believe people that something was going on. What Marie thought was, why don't we look at how real people behave in real life? She thought, there's a lot of footage from a lot of cameras these days. Modern cities are full with cameras. Let's just study how people really behave when there is an emergency. So what she did, she built a huge database. She asked the police in Copenhagen, in Amsterdam, in Cape Town, and in London, so 4 pretty diverse cities. She asked them, together with her team, obviously, if she could have as many videos as possible of real incidents with real people, someone getting attacked in the street, someone drowning, you name it. And then she could just study how people would really react to a situation like that. So that's what she did. She built a huge database, she ran the numbers, and just 2 years ago, the result was published in American Psychologist, really the top journal in the field. And it was quite, it was quite a bomb going off, I must say, because she basically demolished decades of of research. She discovered that in 90% of all cases, people help each other. So that meant basically that a whole library of experiments could go in the garbage bin, because this is the most powerful evidence you can get. Right? This is real people helping each other in real life. She even found that the more people witness something happen, the more likely it is that you will be helped. Right? Because people find support in one another. It is not true that we are alone in the big anonymous city. It's not true. People are on the lookout for each other. In most cases, we help each other when necessary. So that obviously begs the question, but then what about Kitty Genovese, right? Was that the exception to the rule? Well, we actually know that was a bit of fake history now. So those 37 witnesses didn't really exist. That was just the number of people who were interviewed by the police afterwards. Most of them were asleep and didn't really know what was going on. We even now know that Kitty Genovese that night died in the arms of her friend, who risked her own life by running downstairs. So apparently, we sometimes want to believe the negative stories, right? They often go viral. I see it happening again and again. There's something in us that thinks, oh yes, that must be true. You know, it's planet A, it's a selfish planet. This is how people would really behave. But I really want to assure you, reality is not like Game of Thrones. You know? Game of Thrones is great entertainment. I loved it as well. I binge-watched the whole thing. But it's not just the dragons that are unrealistic. You know, its take on human nature is unrealistic as well. Then the question is obviously, what does this mean about us humans, right? Because you could argue that this behavior, this pro-social behavior, is maybe, you know, just environmental, maybe it's social. So biologists have been asking this question for a long time. Is this nature or nurture, right? People helping each other. Why do we do that? Why are some people genuinely altruistic? Does anyone have read this book, Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene? Quite a few people, I see. Well, this is really one of the classics of biology. It's a brilliant, brilliant book published in the 70s about the role that genes play in the evolution of species, basically. But it's also a little bit of a pessimistic book, you could say. This was the 70s. It was pronounced the me decade, you know, the decade which also saw the rise of neoliberalism and the idea that the free market could solve everything. You may remember Gordon Gekko a little bit later in Wall Street saying greed is good, right? So this really fit the zeitgeist at the time. And Dawkins went a little bit further. He also talked about the social implications of his biological theory. He said, let us try to teach altruism and generosity because we are born selfish, right? And this is, again, obviously classic Veneer Theory. Again, this notion that people are fundamentally selfish, but you can attach a layer of generosity on top of that. The altruism is a little bit artificial, and therefore, yeah, we need schools and teachers and coaches and whatever to make kids a little bit more helpful. Now, I remember when I first read Dawkins' book, I remember when I first, read about evolution theory, and I also remember feeling quite depressed at the time. Because let's be honest, it's a little bit of a depressing theory, right? You've got 4 billion years of evolution, you've got so much suffering, you've got 99% of species going extinct, and now at the end of this whole rat race, here we are, right? We've conquered the globe. We are the super successful species that's been able to visit the moon and do all these awesome things, but in a way, it's a little bit depressing as well, right? It's only, again, recently that I changed my mind about the theory, and it was because of a couple of things. For example, this. There are a couple of things about human nature and about humanity that you can't easily explain if you assume that people are fundamentally selfish. So here we see an emoji of a blushing person. Now, not many people know this, but blushing is a unique human ability. We are the only primate that blushes. We are the only mammal that blushes. We are maybe even the only animal in the whole animal kingdom that blushes. There are some parrots who seem to be doing it, but we're not really sure just yet. We don't know what they're ashamed of. But blushing is a fascinating social phenomenon, of course. Why do we do this? Why do we involuntarily give away our feelings? to other members of our species? Why has that been an evolutionary advantage to us, right? It doesn't really seem like classic selfish behavior. Now, one other thing that really makes us unique, among primates at least, is this. So above we see a chimpanzee, and below we see human eyes. Does anyone notice the difference? Or at least the difference that's important here? It's the eyes. It's really the eyes that make humans special. So if you look at the chimpanzee above, you can see the dark sclera, right? So around the irises, there's the sclera, and they're dark with the chimpanzee. That means it's pretty hard to track the gaze of a chimpanzee. It's pretty hard to see what the chimpanzee is looking at. And this is true for all primates, for the bonobos, for the orangutans, you name it, except for humans. So we have white sclera. That means it's very easy to look one another in the eyes. And we all know how important looking one another in the eyes is to build trust, right? It's important in friendship, it's important in romance, it's important at the work floor, right? We trust each other when we can actually look at one another. This is obviously also what made the Zoom age quite difficult, right? Because it's more difficult to build trust and relationships in a digital way. This is, by the way, also why I'm not a big believer that everything will be digital in the future. You know, we humans, we've been designed for physical, face-to-face contact. But these two things, our eyes and our blushing, they don't really fit the standard narrative of humans being so selfish, right? These things seem to be optimized for trust, that we can actually work together. So there's now a new theory that tries to fit this all in and explain this all. And it's called self-domestication. It's, I think, one of the most interesting theories in modern science today. We all know, I think, what domestication is, right? You've got cows, you've got sheep, you've got goats, you've got dogs, and these animals have been domesticated. You know, in the case of a dog, what happens? Well, you start with a wolf, and then you end up with a chihuahua. Right? That's domestication. A domesticated animal is in general more tamer and friendlier. Now, what's interesting is that scientists have long known that when you domesticate an animal, a certain list of traits starts to appear. Charles Darwin already wrote about this in the 19th century. So what are these traits? Thinner bones, white spots in the fur, floppy ears, smaller brain is a really important effect of domestication. But most importantly, domesticated animals seem to be a lot more friendly, a lot more juvenile. It seems as if they never really want to grow up, right? As if they always want to stay kids, basically. They're just much more playful. If you have a wild animal, a wolf, for example, it is playful in the first couple of weeks, but becomes serious quite quickly. But with domesticated animals, that's different. And what's so interesting is that if you look at this list of traits of the so-called domestication syndrome, you start thinking, but hey, wait a minute. We humans, we seem to be pretty domesticated, right? We also have smaller brains compared to our ancestors. Actually, the Neanderthals, not many people know this, but Neanderthals had bigger brains than us. So what's going on here? And the theory that scientists now have is that we have domesticated ourselves. So over the course of our evolution, over the last 50 to 60,000 years, it was actually the friendliest among us who had the most kids and had the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation, right? This is pretty much the opposite of bad guys finish first. It's more like nice guys finish first. That was what our natural environment was about for a long time. So again, remember, pretty much the opposite of what Thomas Hobbes believed. He believed that in the state of nature, we were in a sort of war of all against all, right? And it was the alpha man who really made all the difference. Now we know that it's quite the opposite. There's a lot of research, anthropological research into how nomadic hunter-gatherers organize themselves. And one of the findings is that these societies are often really, really egalitarian, sometimes even proto-feminist, you could argue. So there's relative equality between the sexes, especially if you compare it to the farmers who came after that. So this self-domestication, what does it look like? It looks something like this. Above, we have the domestication of the wolf that turns into a dog or a puppy, and below, we have the domestication of humans. Now you may think, Rutger, you're really good at illustrating, and that is true, but this one's actually from a scientific journal, and it's based on archaeological findings. So if you look at humans, human skeletons, human remains from 50,000 years ago, you look at their skulls, you see the shape of the skull changing, and you can sort of see that people have been starting to look friendlier and nicer in the course of our evolution, right? That is really fascinating. Now, below on the right, you have the modern human, and I've come up with a scientific term of my own, and I hope to be remembered in the annals of science by that. So I have come to call the modern humans Homo puppy. That's basically what we are. If we have this whole new theory, and there's much more that I could go on for quite a while, this new evidence from biology, from archaeology, from sociology, you name it, then you got to start wondering about the implications, right? What does this all mean? And as I said, it's not just armchair philosophy. It really has massive ramifications for how we live our lives, how we organize our companies, organizations, et cetera, et cetera. Because if you think about it, Veneer theory implies that we need a lot of management, a lot of hierarchy, et cetera. If it is true that people are fundamentally selfish, then we need kings and queens and CEOs and presidents and you name it to protect us from ourselves. But if it is true that people have evolved to work together, that we are the product of what scientists now call survival of the friendliest, then maybe, just maybe, we can organize our society in a radically different way. And maybe we can, move to a much more egalitarian, genuinely democratic society. And one of the reasons I embarked on this research is because I started to notice that already a movement had grown of people who are basically already doing this. Entrepreneurs, activists, you name it, who were already applying this new view of human nature in practice, but they didn't really know that they were part of a bigger movement, right? That actually many more people are doing it. So I would like to look at a couple of examples. You may have heard of this organization, buurtzorg. Please raise your hand if you know about buurtzorg. I'm really happy to see this, that already quite a few people know about it. So it was founded in the Netherlands in 2006 by a good friend of mine named Jos de Blok. And if you talk to Jos de Blok, I must say, you don't feel like you're talking to some grand philosopher or anything like that. It more feels like you're talking to your uncle who, just had 5 beers and is complaining about management. So he really says that kind of thing like, management is bullshit and just get out of the way, let people do their job, blah, blah, blah. That's basically his worldview. But the difference in his case is that he has built the most successful healthcare organization in the Netherlands with now 15,000 employees. And I always call him a walking middle finger towards management in Dutch healthcare because he's basically done the impossible. According to independent observers, buurtzorg delivers better healthcare, basically of a higher quality with higher client satisfaction. His employees earn a higher wage compared to his competitors, and it's also cheaper for the government. And the thing is, he did it by relying on this fundamentally different view of human nature. So buurtzorg started in 2006. Back then it was illegal. But he said, okay, we're not going to deliver all these kind of products anymore. I'm not sure how that works in Finland, but at the time we had this craze for market forces in healthcare. So there was a very complicated administration machine where you had to say, like I spent 7 minutes doing the dishes, 6 minutes helping this lady out of bed, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that had to be administrated so they could compare how the different organizations were doing and then they could compete in the marketplace and blah, blah, blah. And Jos de Blok didn't want any of that. He said, I am delivering only one product and it is called care. My people are caring for people who are in need of care, and we're not going to do all that administration, and we're going to work in self-directed teams. So basically no management. All the self-directed teams will decide for themselves what kind of additional education they need, who are they going to hire as colleagues, et cetera, how their whole schedule looks for that week, how they want to do their work, because they're the professionals, right? They really care about their own job. They know how to do it. I don't know how to do that. So at the time, it seemed pretty utopian in 2006. It was even illegal, technically. He wasn't following the rules. But today, it's an organization with 15,000 employees. And people from around the world come to Almelo, which is, I can assure you, one of the ugliest places in the Netherlands. If you see his car, you'll vomit. If you see the office, it's like, oh. But if you look at what's actually happening behind that, I think it's pretty amazing. And it's grounded in this new view of human nature, that you can rely on the intrinsic motivation of your employees. I mean, at conferences like these, we talk a lot about that, about the importance of purpose, about the importance of motivation, that you really believe in what you're doing. But at the same time, the numbers don't look really good, right? We've got, according to recent evidence, around 25% of the modern workforce who think that their own jobs are socially meaningless, right? We've got, in quite a few jobs, a crisis of motivation. People don't really know why they're doing what they're doing. A lot of super smart, intelligent people, they go into finance, into consulting, into management. And I'm not saying all of that is BS, but I do consider that quite often a waste of talent. And it's not just me thinking that, right? If you also look at the rate of burnouts and depression among young professionals, it is sobering, right? We really see this crisis of motivation both in education and in the workforce, I think. And you cannot solve that with just a layer of purpose, right? You cannot solve that by just saying, oh, let's bring in the purpose consultants to think about what we're actually doing here. No, it's really got to start. That's got to be at the heart of what you're doing. We got to try and find to go back to this original source of motivation, what psychologists call intrinsic motivation. Another example of someone who's been doing that in a pretty radical way, or people who've been doing that, is the criminal justice system in Norway. And this is, again, an example where, especially people from abroad, the Americans, for example, they can't believe what's happening there and why it's working. Bastøy Prison. How many of you know about Bastøy Prison? Great. So this is actually the most effective prison in the world. And the reason it's the best prison in the world is that it doesn't really look like a prison at all. So let's look at some photos. This is in Norway, by the way. It's a little bit to the south of Oslo. This is one of the inmates having a good time. These are some of the guards, drinking coffee with the inmates. And here they all are sunbathing together. Why is this the best prison in the world? Well, criminologists are very often interested in this one simple metric that you may have heard about. It's the recidivism rate. The chance that someone will commit another crime once he or she gets out of prison. This is sort of the gold standard for a good prison, right? You want your recidivism rate to be as low as possible. And it turns out that actually this prison that doesn't really look like a prison at all has the lowest recidivism rate in the world. What do people do at Bastøy Prison? Well, they can go to the movies, they can study, they can follow a lot of education. They've got a ski slope, I was told. They've got their own band, the Bastøy Jazz Band. They've even got their own music record. It's called Criminal Records. It's really weird in many respects. And you also think but then, did they commit small crimes or something like that? No, actually not. These are rapists. These are often murderers. They're allowed to go to Bastøy if they've done like 75% or something like that of their sentence. But these people have done really, really terrible things. And yet Norway has decided to treat them in this way, to treat them as human beings with potential, etc. There was even this one story of someone at Bastøy who had killed someone with, sorry, this is a rather horrific story, but he killed someone with a chainsaw. And here at Bastøy on the island, he was allowed to cut trees with a chainsaw. Now, a couple of years ago, a group of Americans went to Norway to study the criminal justice system there because, again, the numbers don't lie. This is, statistically speaking, the best prison in the world. And they were pretty shocked, but they started to become convinced when they saw more and more of the evidence. So one really important piece of evidence was provided by a group of economists, 2 Norwegian economists and 2 American economists. And they looked at the effect of putting someone behind bars in Norway. Now what's interesting, if you ever commit a crime in Norway and you are at the judge and the judge asks you, do you want some kind of task, right? I don't know, work in social services for 200-300 hours or something like that, or do you want to be sent to prison? My advice, remember this, it might happen, remember this, go to prison. Actually, people come out of Norwegian prisons as better people. Their chance of finding employment goes up by, 40-50%. This is, I must assure you, this is really radical. There are no other prisons like that. Most prisons are what we call universities for crime, right? People come out worse than they actually were, and there's a really high reoffending rate. But somehow in Bastøy, they've managed to break that cycle. Now, I understand, of course, the moral difficulties that people may have with this. Don't we want vengeance, right? Don't we want retribution? How do, the parents of the victims or the friends of the victims, how do they think about this? And that is a very good question. This is not easy at all. This is very, very difficult. It requires self-restraint. It requires a kind of civilization and self-mastery and control that is very, very difficult to achieve as a society, but somehow they've done it. There was this documentary where they interviewed a couple of parents who lost one of their children during the Breivik massacres. And it was really astonishing to hear some about them speak and say that they didn't want to sink to the level of the perpetrators, right? But wanted to be on the moral high ground. Now, some of you may think, oh, but this is one of the exceptions in Norway. Most of the sort of maximum security prisons are much different in Norway. And if you think that, I'd like to show you a video of an American documentary maker named Michael Moore, who basically wanted to see that for himself. So here he visits one of the other prisons in Norway, and well, let's see how that went.
I wanted to see a maximum security facility. And that's where I went. When the prison first opened in 2010, the guards wanted to send a strong message to the new inmates. So they made this orientation video.
There comes a time when we hear the sudden call, when the world must come together as one. There are people dying, and it's time to lend a hand to live the greatest gift of all.
Is that Braille? It's Braille for the blind?
Yeah, for the blind, yes. It's art, modern art.
You have modern art throughout the prison here.
We are the world, we are the children.
How many fights have you been in?
I have never been in fights, actually.
You don't need a knife to protect yourself with?
Oh, no.
No.
You don't need that.
No. Show me your wounds so that now there are times you've been stabbed.
Oh, no, never.
Never been stabbed?
I've never been stabbed.
How many times have you been beaten up here by other prisoners?
No, never.
How many times have you been raped in the shower?
Never. This is not gonna happen because you got your own shower.
No, here's the bed.
Okay, that's a bed.
Yeah.
TV.
Got the flat screen TV.
I'm painting, and besides that, I'm studying art class,
You're taking philosophy class.
I'm gonna have exam after summer, so I want to work with community problems and things like that, maybe politics later on, so.
That's not a bad idea. Go to prison first, then become a politician.
So what I really, really love about this example, and it's for Michael Moore. What I really, really love about this example is that initially the response is, oh, this is so naive, right? Oh, this is some silly IKEA prison. But then you look at it working in practice and it's like, hey, but wait a minute, weren't we all naive? Weren't we naive when we said we live on planet A where people are fundamentally selfish, right? Isn't it much more realistic to move to a more hopeful view of human nature, of who we are as a species, right? Isn't that where we should be going. I understand that, sure, it's tough. Sometimes we have our inclinations for distrust as well. But if we then look at the hard, practical results, if we look at the return on investments for employees, even for criminals, it seems to me clear that we can do things in a really radically different way. Now, the boss of Bastard Prison put it in a really wonderful way. He said it like this: treat people like dirt, and they'll be dirt. Treat them like human beings, and they'll act like human beings. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic. That was fantastic. I had a quick question for you, which was when we talk about the instinct to save someone, the Kitty Genovese versus the Dutch people. And by the way, Dutch people will jump in a canal for no reason, so I don't think that was. But don't you think personal danger might be a thing? Because I think those people probably thought they could jump in relatively free of risk. But if I saw someone with a gun in an armed robbery, I would jump in and save a drowning kid. Would I stop an armed robbery? I don't know.
So in the United States, you have the Carnegie Hero Fund. It's existed since 1906, and they've basically been giving medals to people who did heroic things. And it's really a goldmine for psychologists and researchers because they can just interview the people who did something heroic, really risk their own lives to save someone else. And the striking thing about that research is that they haven't been able to find anything. There's nothing that distinguishes heroes from the rest of the population. You know, they're young, old, highly educated, little education, rich, poor, it doesn't really matter. It's really the situation in which they were. So heroes are ordinary people in an extraordinary situation and then do the right thing. And if you interview them afterwards, what's really interesting is that they say, I didn't really think about it. It seemed to be the natural response. And most of the time, they say, I think anyone else would have done this. And then usually we see that as, I don't know, modesty or something like that. But it's not modesty. It is, I think, really true that most of us would do that in a similar situation.
If there was a gun, I don't know. But that's good. Okay, someone asked the question, it was Philippe who asked the question, I want to believe Planet B. What can I do to reveal that in and to others?
As I said, we humans, we often become the stories that we tell ourselves. You know, one of the stories that I dug into for my research is the story of Lord of the Flies, the novel. Did anyone read Lord of the Flies in school? Oh, quite a few, so it's pretty famous here as well. Lord of the Flies, for those who don't know, it's a story about kids who shipwreck on an island. Or actually, there's an airplane crash. Anyway, a lot of airplane crashes back then. And the kids wash up in this island, and they try to establish a democracy of sorts. They try to be friendly, but very quickly they show who they really are, animals, beasts. And at the end of the novel, 3 of the kids are dead, and it's a really terrible story. Again, Veneer Theory. The message is civilization is only a thin veneer, and even these nicely educated kids from a boarding school, they'll behave in a horrible way. I thought, well, this is a novel, right? Maybe there's a story or some incident that happened sometime in all of human history where a real kid shipwrecked on a real island, because that would be really interesting to see what happened, right? So as a proper investigative journalist, I just started on Google, kids on an island, shipwreck, blah, blah, blah. And after basically months of research, I found one incident that happened in Tonga, an island group in the Pacific Ocean, where 6 kids were shipwrecked. They somehow managed to survive for 15 months. And I assure you, if this would be a Hollywood movie, people would say, God, this is worse than Love Actually, right? It's so sentimental because it's really a story about the power of friendship, of how they survived for 15 months. And I always say that if people still have to read Lord of the Flies in school, then please let's also tell them about the one time in all of world history that we know of when real kids shipwrecked on a real island, because that's a very, very different story. It's a story of trust, cooperation, etc. And that matters. It really matters which kind of stories we tell to ourselves and to our kids.
Last question. There's not a ton of time, but I wanted to ask, the Russian attack, the war going on right now, does that change your view at all? I mean, the existence of war itself and the cruelty that happens there, certainly there's some wrong planetism there.
Absolutely. If you write about human decency, obviously, you gotta go on for hundreds of pages about all the terrible atrocities and the terrible things that we humans can do to one another. I think one of the mechanisms here is actually in this phenomenon of friendliness itself, right? Very often we can do the nastiest things in the name of loyalty, in the name of friendship, right? So there's a lot of really extraordinary research that shows that soldiers mostly don't fight for the grand ideals or their leaders, but actually for their comrades. So this is also something to be wary of ourselves, right? Sometimes we actually do bad things because we just want to be friendly.
We are out of time. Hartstikke bedankt. Thank you very much. Rutger Bregman.
Thanks.